May the words of my mouth, and meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Please. Have any of us ever wanted to be famous? I think if I ask that question, I would assume that the answer for many of us is yes. We would all have liked to have been famous at some point. It's only human nature. This desire to be known and recognized in stores and in restaurants and public places. Where that desire comes from, I haven't a clue. I don't know quite where it does. But usually fame is linked with fortune, fame and fortune. So I'm assuming that when we fantasize about being famous, we also fantasize about being wealthy as well. We also can't help it, I believe, it's because of the era that we live in. We live in an era of celebrity culture. It's all around us. And fame is this desire that is sought after almost every second of the day on social media. And it's really interesting. Some mass media scholars even argue that the lessons that we used to reserve for our parents and family and peers, we would learn from them, we now actually learn from celebrities, people that we don't know at all, we just have a familiarity with. And one hallmark of this era is this phrase that's called famous for being famous. And that means simply that not too long ago, fame was something that we assigned to people who actually did something. They were like held a public office, they were an entertainer, an athlete, an author, maybe a captain of industry, something like that. But now the goal is just to get noticed. Look at me. That's the kind of the goal of social media. And what we've done is we've traded achievement for recognition. If you read the psalm today, it's one of my favorites. It's all about being known and being famous in a sense, but it contrasts sharply with what it means to be famous in popular culture. The psalmist says that God knows us in this deep, deep way. The language, if you go back and look at the language, it's starkly intimate. God knows every fiber. You know when I sit and rise. You know every word before I even say it. You know when I sleep. It's this very, very intimate kind of thing. And this type of intimacy should be a little bit uncomfortable. It is for me. Because it means that there's no hiding from God. If He knows when we sleep and stand, that means He knows it all. He knows the times when we've been truly unselfish, the times we've helped someone and never crowed about it, the times that somebody who could have said something mean back in a conversation, but we bit our tongue and let the other person have their point. Yes, that, but also all those other times when all those self-righteous thoughts that we might have, or the times when we really did say mean things back to someone, or when we boasted about that. It's all known to God. It's warts and all. There's no hiding. So in a sense, we already are famous in heaven, but we can't, and I don't think we can be known that much more intimately. But one of my favorite authors, his name is C.S. Lewis. He's the Christian apologist. He wrote also the Chronicles of Narnia, for those of you familiar with that. He suggested a different take on being famous in heaven. He once wrote this book, it's a fantasy book, about a place between heaven and hell where you have the chance to face that chief issue that is keeping you out of heaven. And so a guide is sent to you to sort of help you get through it and sort of face the issue. So during one scene, the narrator of the book and the guide that was sent with him, they come upon this parade in the middle of the field. People are just going nuts. They're cheering and applauding, and it's this one special woman who's sort of being part of the parade, and everyone's like just like this big bandwagon kind of thing. And the narrator says to his guide, he says, "Oh wow, she must have been really famous." Oh, and his guide says, "Yeah, she was. She was one of the greats." So the narrator finally gets a chance to see her. And he says, well, I don't recognize her. And he says, well, you wouldn't. She was just ordinary to you. But to every child who came to her door, she became their mother. And to every person she met, she offered kindness to them. And so the guy looks at the narrator, and the narrator still looks confused. And he says, finally, he says, you remember, fame up here is much, much different than fame down there. So if we look around at our congregation and try to guess which one of us is famous in heaven, which one of us isn't, the funny thing is we should have a really hard time figuring that out. Because being famous in heaven implies that there's a bit of anonymity to our actions. If we were on the heavenly version of Snapchat, that is one thing. But we shouldn't be in this for the recognition. We're in this for the service, for the giving without ceasing, just for the good of all of those around us. We shouldn't be seeking credit or gratitude. Knowing that we are doing God's work, that should be thanks enough. And it should be our own reward. And the really great thing about all this is that all of us have an equal chance of being famous in heaven. Here on earth, it's really hard to get noticed, or it's noticed, you can get noticed, but you only get 15 minutes of fame, and then it's gone. How many people you used to know were being famous, but whatever happened to them? In heaven, it's permanent, and all of us get the chance to be famous in heaven. The other part of today's readings offers this yet another layer when discussing our behavior. Even though God has the power to know all of our hearts, we don't have that power. It's ironic, but it's true. Even as intimate, as personal as God knows us, knowing those inner parts of us, we do not have that privilege with each other. I can only guess what is in your heart. You can only guess what is in mine. And we just have this one tool, this one lone tool to help us figure it all out. And that is how we act towards one another, or how we behave. And so that brings us to the New Testament lesson for today. This is the letter of Paul to Philemon. This letter of Paul is really interesting because it is one of the very, very few writings that almost no scholar over the last 2,000 years has ever questioned if this is an actual letter from Paul. There are a lot of other letters in the New Testament where they're kind of not sure. Corinthians looks like it's like maybe 4 letters put into 2, things like that. This one, no one questions that it's from Paul. In it, he's making this appeal to the title character, Philemon, whose slave has run away and possibly stealing money. And in those things, to use a phrase from out here in the West, that was a hanging offense. But the slave has found God and turned his whole life around. And so Paul writes that his slave, Onesimus, has become very useful to Paul, but technically he's Philemon's property. So Onesimus, though, is ready to do the right thing. He is ready to face the consequences of his actions. If he was playing in the NFL, all of his teammates would say to him, he's ready to man up. Now, I prefer a much less sexist term, but you get the point. He was going to face the consequences of his action. So for Paul, the right thing to do for him is to send Onesimus back to Philemon. And so he does with this letter that has survived 2 millennia. And Paul tells Philemon to take Onesimus back, but treat him decently. Let him live, really. And no flogging and maltreatment. Paul tells Philemon that he, Paul, could actually pull rank and order Philemon to treat Onesimus decently, but instead he says, I'm appealing to your goodness. It would be better if Philemon came to this decision to treat Onesimus decently on his own accord, to behave like a Christian should behave. And so for Philemon, the right thing to do is to accept this slave back as a brother in Christ And that means an equal with him before God. Ownership and property are just human inventions. In the kingdom of God, we all belong to God. So Paul asks that Philemon not think about who the slave was, but who he's become. And if it's the money, Paul says, hey, I'll take care of it. If it's the offense of running away, Paul says, just ignore that and accept the slave back. In essence, Paul is telling Philemon to prove he's a Christian by acting like one. Do the right thing. Do what Jesus would do. I think all of us have those Philemon moments in our lives. We all have that times when no one else will know. It's just us and God. And no one will ever find out except for the one who knows when we sit and stand, who knows the very words we speak before we say them. We can run, but we cannot hide. We are known to the one who made us and loves us unconditionally. But no one else in the world can see that in our hearts. They can only look at how we act, at our actions, at our behaviors. And in the end, all we have is our behavior to show others and the rest of the world who we are. It's a cop-out to say, oh, you should know what's in my heart. Our behavior shows others what's in our hearts. It's the old saying, if we were put on trial for being a Christian, would there be any evidence to convict us? So I believe that God constantly calls us to do the Philemon thing, the right thing, to act the way that often goes against our very nature, to give without expecting something in return, to do a job without expecting someone to say thank you, to not wait for that, to dissolve class structure, to accept people for the way that God sees them and not how they fit in our set of social rules. So in just about a week, a little over a week, we will once again in this church accept people here to our congregation through Family Promise who have struggled and maybe they've made some bad choices, but who are trying to do the right thing, especially by their families, mostly their young children. And what is our response to that? Mary and Rick and Ronnie, they do a really great job of saying thank you to all those who volunteer and pitch in. But our attitude actually should be more like Paul and Philemon. We should do all this, not because of the recognition, but just because it's the right thing to do. We should do this not to expect someone to say thank you, but just because it's the right thing to do. We should give what we can to the struggling families, not just to be able to fill in another line of righteous acts that we performed in our book, but just simply because it's the right thing to do. We give, we help, we try, we listen, we lend a hand. To every child we meet, we become a mother. To every person we meet, we extend them kindness. And that, I believe, my brothers and sisters, is how we become famous in heaven.